Good morning. Hosea appears first in the minor prophets, although he wasn't the first of them historically. The reason he was put first, at least as it's explained in the rabbinic literature, is that it says, the word of the Lord first spoke to Hosea. And obviously, that isn't what it meant. It didn't mean that he was the first one that the Lord spoke to, but that's, the kind of little trick that you get used in the rabbinic literature, especially to explain things. But he was probably a younger contemporary of Hosea. The list of kings that's given has him last into the reign of Hezekiah. We're not sure when Hezekiah came to the throne. It was either 725 or 715. And the difference that would make is that if it was the later date, then Hosea would have lived through the destruction of Samaria. But you can't really trust those superscriptions very well anyway, because I think these were added on hundreds of years later and people were making a guess at it. The most colorful thing probably in the book of Hosea is what happens here at the very beginning. The Lord first spoke to Hosea. The Lord said to Hosea, "Go take for yourself a wife of whoredom and beget children of whoredom." Well, if the Lord said that to you, what would you do? The idea of it is obvious enough, that he wants to express the idea that Israel is whoring after foreign gods. This is an image we meet a lot of in the Hebrew Bible. We know one of the things that these prophets did was symbolic action, which was a kind of street theater. We'll find Ezekiel is probably the master of it, where he does some really disgusting things. Isaiah goes around naked for a couple of years. Hosea, I think this is maybe the hardest assignment any of them got. Go marry a harlot. Now, what it means, is up for grabs. Does it mean that he actually married somebody who was known to be a prostitute? Well, it could. It used to be very popular to suppose that she was a cult prostitute. And you may still read this in some of the literature. The idea being that in Canaanite cult, they had prostitutes with whom people would have ritual intercourse as a way of ensuring fertility. But that whole theory has kind of fallen into disrepute because the Greek historian Herodotus talks about a foul custom of the Babylonians. But people now tend to think that Herodotus was a little bit credulous and that this was, I suppose it made his history more readable to stick in such foul customs of the Babylonians and the like. But people are very skeptical about that nowadays. It could also mean just marry a woman who is not going to be faithful. Depending on what you make of chapter 3, it may indicate that at one point he has to take her back. But it is a degree of intrusion, you see, into the prophet's personal life that would have been a little bit hard to live with, one would think. And not only that, but beget children. First one gets named Jezreel. That's not so bad. The reason for it is, in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. Now, you remember that story. The blood of Jezreel was when Jehu came in and killed Jezebel, among others. He was doing this on the instruction of the prophet Isaiah, but according to Hosea, that's something that God will punish Israel for. This is a case, if you like, of one prophet countermanding the instruction of another. Or you'll find next day in Isaiah that Isaiah says that Assyria is the rod of Yahweh's anger, but it's still liable to punishment because it goes too far. And maybe that's the implication here, that Jehu went too far, but it is noteworthy that it is one prophet criticizing something that was done on the instruction of a different prophet. But then the other two kids get worse monikers. The first one is called Not Loved. You think, what would that do to the psychology of a kid? And the one after that is nearly as bad, Not My People. Again, how will this go on the playground? But you see, there's really no regard for the personal life of the prophet. His children are kind of extensions of his message. And of course, the implication of Not My People is, say to him, you are not my people and I am not your God. Now, that is a covenant formula, at least taking covenant in the general sense, of an agreement. But now, whereas in the book of Deuteronomy, the idea of a covenant is modeled on a treaty. It's a legal document. In the book of Hosea, the idea of a covenant is modeled on marriage. And this was the typical wedding formula. She is my wife, I am her husband. So to say, I am not your God, you are not my people, is tantamount to divorce. It's saying the relationship is off. You will have heard last semester, you have basically two kinds of covenant in the Hebrew Bible, one of which is the Davidic covenant, which is really just a promise, unconditional, not revocable, and the other one is very conditional. And that's the Mosaic covenant, and that's what, it's that tradition that both Amos and Hosea are speaking to. But it continues in verse 10, yet the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, and where it was said, you are not my people, it shall be said, children of the living God. One suspects in a case like that this was added later, a little bit like the ending in the book of Amos, to, not end on such a downer note as you otherwise would. But it also does seem, I think, that Hosea had hopes for something beyond the destruction. That he isn't, you don't have quite the same unrelieved gloom in Hosea that you had in Amos. So, continuing in chapter 2, plead with your mother, plead. But plead isn't really a good translation there. It's more like bring a lawsuit against. It's not ask her, please come back. It's sue her. For she is not my wife and I am not her husband. And again, this is the language of divorce. The word in Hebrew there is called a reeve. And reeve you will often see explained as a covenant lawsuit. I'm not sure the covenantal part is fully appropriate here, but it is legal terminology. A reeve is a lawsuit. And now, so that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, or I will strip her naked and expose her as on the day she was born and make her a wilderness. Now, what unfolds then in this poem is an extended allegory, metaphor, of Israel as an unfaithful woman. Now, to say to the land, I am going to strip you naked, is one thing. Because actually, it's a pretty good analogy for what the Assyrians would do to it. If you go through and burn down all the vineyards and burn down anything of value, in effect, you're stripping the land naked and making it into a desert. And that's the other motif that you're playing on here, because it's taking Israel back to the wilderness in quite a literal way. The reason this passage has been controversial in recent times is that the implication seems to be that this is the appropriate thing to do to an unfaithful woman. Now, we'll find a little bit later that Hosea himself will say, actually, the men are worse. But nonetheless, Israel is, in these situations, typically portrayed as a woman. There is an even worse passage, a much worse passage in my mind, in the book of Ezekiel, which talks about cutting her in pieces. And some people, this was quite topical 10 or 15 years ago. Some people refer to this as prophetic pornography. Now, is it? What do you think? You'll have an opportunity to discuss this one in section with an article by Renita Weems next week. Obviously, it's not saying you should do this to an actual woman. It is metaphorical. Also, if you follow Deuteronomy, this isn't what you're supposed to do. What you're supposed to do is stone her. But I think you probably adapt it here for the sake of applying it as a metaphor. You can't very well speak of stoning the land. You can't speak of stripping the land and shaming it and humiliating it. But the rub with it is, if you're using that as a metaphor, are you condoning it somehow at the literal level? Speak up, Gloria. Yeah? Is it by chance that they use female imagery? Probably not. Probably, the laws. There are many cases where you have laws that require both parties to be stoned in the case of adultery, but there are also many cases where the punishment falls more on the woman. Now, and in fact, Hosea later on will object to that. It doesn't quite make him a feminist, I'm afraid. But I think he is reflecting the values of the society. That's why I think one has to be careful preaching this kind of material nowadays, or even using it in the lectionary, because there is that catch, as to just what is this conveying. In fact, I remember when I was teaching at the University of Chicago, we're discussing the passage in Ezekiel, and one woman in the class said, "But God had to do this to her, because of the way she was behaving." And I must say it sent a chill down my spine, because that's what you always hear of abusers saying. I don't want to do this to you, but I have to because of the way you're acting. And the more troubling question that this raises probably is God portrayed here as an abuser towards Israel? In the whole question, you see, in the history of Israel, in the prophets especially, one of the things that's going on is that they want to explain what is happening to them as the work of God. Now, what is happening to them is nearly always horrible. And so you get a lot of passages in the prophets that are somehow trying to justify what's happening to them as divine punishment. And it is a problem. And we will see that problem raised eventually in this course and addressed directly in the book of Job. But it's an assumption in the prophets, and I think it's just something one has to be aware of and be a little bit careful in how you use a passage like this. So, but then it goes on, she said, I will go after her lovers. They give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax. Now, what he's actually talking about there is the popular belief that Baal was the fertility god. And the question here, very much like the story of Elijah, is who is the God who brings the rain? Who is the God that causes the crops to grow? And what Hosea is complaining about is people who worship Baal, thinking that Baal is the one who does. And so it says, therefore, I will take back my grain in my time and my wine in its season, and I will uncover her shame in the sight of her lovers, and so forth. I will lay waste her vines and fig trees, and I will punish her for the festival days of the Baals. Now, all of that so far, it's similar to Amos, except on different grounds. The accusation here is worshipping Baal. You wouldn't get the impression from Amos that anybody was worshipping Baal at all. And they seem to have been contemporaries in northern Israel. These are two different takes. Now, you will get occasionally complaint also in Hosea on social matters, but not nearly as strong as in Amos. But Hosea then goes on. Therefore, I will now allure her and bring her into the wilderness. Now, the word for wilderness there is midbar, and it has a range of meaning. How many of you have been to Israel? And if you've ever, there are degrees of desert. If you go way down near Beersheba, that's real desert. And then you get places like around the Dead Sea, where there actually are some things growing. You wouldn't necessarily want to live there, but still. And then a midbar can also be the step outside the city. And it's used that way also actually in the Song of Songs as a place where lovers might go courting. And so this poem is quite an intricate literary work in which they play on different meanings of midbar like this. On the one hand, midbar is the place of death and punishment. That's what it means when it's going to strip the land and make it into a midbar. But then the midbar is also the place that Israel came through in the course of the Exodus. So it's a place that has hope for the future. And then finally here, it can also be the place of courtship. So I will bring you into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her, and from there I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor. This is the story in the book of Joshua, a door of hope. And there she will respond as in the days of her youth at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. So it's with Hosea here that you first get the motif of a new Exodus. That this is what is needed. And, to speak of a new Exodus means that first of all you have to speak of a new enslavement. You have to do, the hard times must come first before you can then have an exodus out of it. Any question on any of that so far? Yes,
you referred to the valley of Achor in reference to Joshua. Where exactly?
It's I believe it's the story of Achan, who is stoned. I think that's the one. Just after the destruction of Jericho. It should be chapter 8 or thereabouts in Joshua. But, where it's an unmitigated disaster in the book of Joshua, and now it becomes a door of hope. Going on in chapter 4, hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel. The Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. Now, this again is the same word, reeve. It's the lawsuit, the legal imagery. There is no faithfulness or loyalty and no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery break out. What does that sound like? Yeah. It's almost running down the Decalogue. Now, does it mean that he is referring specifically to a covenantal law? Not necessarily, I think, because these are all pretty basic things that you get outlawed in pretty much any society. But they have to do, with social relations. And at this point, this is the one point where he gets off his obsession with the cult and saying that the reason the land mourns is because of a lack of faithfulness and fidelity in relations among the people. And that is what he describes as the lack of the knowledge of God. The knowledge of God would mean having proper relations between the people. Skipping down a little bit in that chapter, therefore, this is verse 13, your daughters play the whore, your daughters-in-law commit adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery, for the men themselves go aside with whores and sacrifice with temple prostitutes. Now again, you could dispute that translation. Thus, a people without understanding comes to ruin. But I underline that passage because Hosea got a bad reputation, at least in recent times, by the use of female imagery in chapter 2. And, in his time, he wasn't so bad. And again, it's not that he's either a libertarian or a feminist on this issue. He's still saying that he would punish he's still holding the women accountable to some degree, but he's saying the men are as bad, if not worse. And that's what I think should be noted to his credit. Skip down a little bit to chapter 6. Now, he begins here, come let us return to the Lord. And this, I think, is a quotation. This is quoting what people are supposedly saying. It is he who has torn, he will heal us. He has struck us down, he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the 3rd day, he will raise us up. Now, I note that verse because it gets used in the New Testament in a totally different sense. What it means, a very typical idiom, we had it in the book of Amos, for 3 crimes of Israel and for 4. And here, in 2 days and in 3. It just means in a short time. Is all it means here. And what he's talking about is not raising people up from the dead, but rather restoring the people and restoring their fortunes. Let us press on to know the Lord, and so forth. And then you get the response in verse 4. What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes away early. Now, what he's complaining about is, when times are bad, they say, oh, come, let's pray to the Lord. And then when things improve, they forget about it again. Therefore, I have hewn them by the prophets, I have killed them by the words of my mouth. For I desire, in the NRSV, it says steadfast love and not sacrifice. The word for steadfast love is a Hebrew word, chesed, for which there is really no good English equivalent. Sometimes it's taken to be loyalty, fidelity, decency even, but it's doing the right thing. So some kind of right conduct and not sacrifice. Now, this is what you get consistently in all of these 8th century prophets. That what God wants is not sacrifice. And it's a long-standing debate. How literally do they mean that? Because most people figure you could not imagine a cult in the ancient world without some kind of sacrificial ritual. And certainly most of the Old Testament is based on the assumption that there must be some kind of sacrificial ritual. But what I think is going on here with all of them is that they're not philosophizing about cult in general. They're speaking to what they actually saw in practice. And what they're saying is, your cultic activity is more of a hindrance than a help. Because when people go and offer their sacrifices, they feel they have done all they need to do. And what all of these prophets are saying is, that is not the case. That is not what is of the essence of religion. It's a question of priorities. It's a question of what is most important, of relative importance. So I wouldn't necessarily conclude that they were imagining a state with no cult at all, but they didn't like what they saw going on at the temples, either in Bethel or in Jerusalem. Shana?
When you have some information to be speaking to do scholarship to be the end of 6 to like who Isaiah's quoting there.
Who is he quoting? I think he's quoting hypothetical people.
Right.
So hypothetical people who say, come, let us return to the Lord. So, it's probably paraphrasing what people were doing. And he's not impressed. Yeah. Now, the main attraction, I would say, of the book of Hosea is that he's constantly using metaphors. And you get a string of them here in the following chapters. For example, in chapter 7, verse 11, Ephraim has become like a dove, silly and without sense. And there are others in that vein. But there's quite a parade of imagery. Another one, chapter 9, like grapes in the wilderness I found Israel, like the first fruits on a fig tree. But probably the most sustained and significant use of metaphorical language, I think, is in chapter 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him. Interesting that Israel can be male some of the time. It's only when infidelity is involved that Israel becomes female. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now, of course, the idea that Israel is the son of God is something that you get already in the book of Exodus, where Moses is told to say to Pharaoh, Israel is my firstborn son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. And yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, and they did not know that it was I who healed them. And this, I think, is a rather nice image of God lifting the child, teaching it to walk, and so forth. I bent down to them and fed them. And then you get an abrupt change. They shall return to the land of Egypt, and Assyria shall be their king. See, almost everything in Hosea is metaphorical. Does he mean they will actually go back to Egypt? No. What he means is they will return to a state of enslavement. And this time it will be Assyria. The sword rages in their cities. And then in verse 8, he switches back again. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God. And now the translation here is no mortal. It's Adam in the Hebrew. The older translations would have said, I am God and not man. Maybe God and not human. And I will not come to destroy. Now, what's the difference between being God and being human? And which does he sound more like here? It's probably the most human portrayal of God that you get anywhere in the Bible. He's a God who's very emotional, for good and bad. And, it pictures God as the father teaching the child to walk. You can relate to it, especially if you have children. That no matter what they do or how they turn out, you can think of what they were like when they were little children. And you say, no, you can't. You can't disown them. But is that to be God or to be human? What's the difference? What is it that makes God God in this passage? Yes. Yeah. I think the implication is, if you're human, sometimes you can be overcome by your worst instincts. If you're God, supposedly, you don't have to. You can rise above that. So I think that's probably a good way of putting it. The ability to really love unconditionally. And we'll see in a minute, it's more complicated than that here. There is a problem with it, with the implementation of it. But now, you see, how does one get to speak about God at all? How is one to imagine God? We've seen a couple of ways already. One of them is you imagine God as a king, just bigger and stronger than any other king. So power, that's part of it. This, I think, is a nice one. God as the best in humanity. Like the best in humanity, only better, without human limitations. And I think that informs also the metaphor of marriage that runs through the early chapters of Hosea. That God is, however harsh he may seem in some of it, he is still the one who can take Israel back. He can forgive. Anything else? Andrew.
In regards to the marriage, is that also that God is ever faithful, even in God's wrath?
I think so, yes. Yeah, yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Feels like it mirrors the earlier Mosaic section where Moses would intercede on behalf of other people to remind
Yeah.
God, aren't you slave in your
Yes. Yeah.
It's almost like God's doing that God's.
That's right. And it's a nice point, because in some other passages, God needs somebody else to do that for him. If I may be pardoned slipping into the masculine pronoun. But this is the problem, that God doesn't always act that way in the Bible. So really, I think what Hosea is saying, this is how God should be. Is it how God should be, or it's how we should think of God? But it's certainly, I think, trying to refine the idea of God, because there are lots of passages in the Hebrew Bible where God is distinguished just by raw power. You think, of Elijah on Mount Carmel, who is the real God. The God who answers with fire is God. Is that all that's to it? Well, not according to this. But as I say, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because we then turn over to chapter 13. Just a little bit later. Yet I have been your Lord, the Lord your God, ever since the land of Egypt. You know no God but me, and besides me there is no Savior. It was I who fed you in the wilderness, the land of drought. This all sounds very much like chapter 11. They were satisfied and their heart was proud, therefore they forgot me. So I will become like a lion to them. Like a leopard I will lurk on the way. I will fall upon them like a bear robbed of her cubs. I will tear open the covering of their heart. I will devour them like a lion. Like a wild animal would mangle them. I will destroy you, O Israel. Who can help you? And further down in verse 14, shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? Sheol is the netherworld. O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your destruction? Compassion is hid from my eyes. Well, what do you make of that? Has he had a lapse of memory from chapter 11? What about remembering teaching Ephraim to walk at this stage? Now, you see, there is one other major way in which people figured out the will of God, or thought they found revelations of God. And that is in history, meaning in what actually happens. Now, what actually happened to Samaria, to northern Israel? It fell to the Assyrians. What did that mean in practice?
It violated everything that they were taught with Deuteronomy, so they had to basically do their first works over entirely.
Well, yeah, but I mean, what happened to the people in Samaria, in northern Israel? Exile for the lucky ones.
Oh, they were put back.
Because an awful lot of them were killed. Some of them fled. A lot of them were taken to exile. Did they ever come back? These become the lost tribes of Israel. Amos got this one right. It was wiped off the face of the earth. There was no second chance for northern Israel. So, which chapter wins out, if you like? There's this wonderfully compassionate chapter in chapter 11 where God thinks of Israel and says, I can't destroy. I will not. I am God and not man. And then in chapter 13, O death, where is your sting? Now, that one is quoted in the New Testament in a totally different meaning. Because in St. Paul, that is taken to mean death has no sting. Here it's, death, give me your sting so that I may sting them with it. It's brutal. It's merciless. Now, this, is the dilemma that the prophets are wrestling with. And if you go by what actually happens, it looks like God got over his feelings of compassion for Ephraim and did in fact destroy. The book doesn't quite end like that, because the book goes on in chapter 14, return, O Israel, to the Lord your God. And this, I think, is the typical upbeat ending that you get in most of the prophetic books. O Ephraim, what have I to do with idols? It is I who answer and look after you. I am like an evergreen cypress. Those who are wise understand these things. Now, this is the prophet saying there is still room for repentance, there is still room for restoration. But this one, I think, is added pretty much after the fact, whether it was added by Hosea himself or not. Because, you see, you have two basic impulses, I think, in how people imagine God. But first of all, God is good. So whatever you think is good, you can ascribe to God in the nth degree. And the other one is, God is the power who controls what actually happens. And in that case, you've got to reconcile somehow the goodness of God with things that happen that don't seem good at all. You can say that God must be merciful because mercy is good. And I might add, they said this about the god Marduk too, that Marduk was compassionate. But then if you're faced with a situation where people are actually destroyed, where a city is conquered, as happens first with Samaria, then with Jerusalem, you've got to somehow factor that in too. Now, I'm not sure there's a logical solution to that. But I think these are two basic ways in which people try to imagine God and think how God relates to human history. The prophets are not philosophers. They do not come up with coherent, systematic theories. So what you get here in Hosea, maybe more obviously in Hosea than anywhere else, actually, is almost a moody God. A God whose moods can swing wildly. And this is done, by imagining on the analogy of human experience. There are more poets than philosophers or theologians, for that of it. There isn't really much attempt to work out a systematic, coherent theory. That's not what they're about. What they're about is speaking to actual crises as they unfolded and to things that actually happened. And so that's what Hosea is wrestling with. What do you think of him? What would you now do with him if you were to preach on him, say? Well, I think you would have to be selective. Degree, I still think that passage in chapter 11 is an inspiring passage. It's holding up a hope. It's fair.
Broken up. There is contradiction within it, but I think it's almost like a mad monologue of a spartan lover. Like God is,
Yeah.
and like the truth you would experience of having infidelity in your marriage. Like you love this
Person, yes.
and you're so mad, and you want to hurt them, but you still love them because you have compassion. It's almost
Yeah.
like, in that part with shall I ransom them and how should I save them? Should I have mercy? I'm just not feeling compassionate right now.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like the way you do that during that monologue or staying out.
Yeah.
That's what it's all.
Yeah. And what it's being true to, I think, is probably human experience. Because in the end of the day, that's all we can know. That's all we've got to work with. In the later theology, God is often called the unmoved mover. Not here. And in fact, in the Old Testament, generally speaking, you know, this is a changeable God. A God who has moods, has good days and bad days. And one hopes that the best will prevail. But in many ways, I think that's maybe a more accurate reflection of reality than what you get in a more abstract kind of theology. Yes, Gloria? Sorry, say the last bit again. Yeah. Well, you see, in a way, the prophets are saying it is your actions that led to this. But what they all assume is that what actually happens is controlled by God. Now, you see, we don't normally, in practice, think that way in the modern world. But in the ancient world, they do. So that if there's a bad storm, God is angry. Now, the Old Testament actually tones that down a bit. But they very much think that, if people are prospering, that's divine blessing. If people are faced with disaster, that must be divine punishment for something. Now, what the prophets actually are doing is telling people to take responsibility for those things yourselves. Think, what are you doing that brought this upon you? And, there's a good side to that, and there's a limitation to it. But the good side, I think, is that they are telling people, to think of what you yourselves are doing and take responsibility for it. Okay, next day, Monday, I guess you'll have your section now this week. And Monday, we'll move on to the prophet Isaiah, who is a different frame of reference, but certainly one of the greatest of the prophets.